Hello, this is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast. Here tonight, I'm joined by Eugene Montsalvat. Is that correct?
Montsalvat.
Montsalvat, thank you. And Eugene Montsalvat writes for Right On, and he identifies as both a nationalist and a socialist. So why don't you explain what socialism and nationalism, from your perspective, implies?
Well, I would consider them two halves of the same coin. We view the nation as a collective, and socialism is a form of economics that emphasizes collective cooperation. So it is cooperative economics in support of the national collective, and national collective in support of economic cooperation.
Okay. So socialism, of course, has a left-wing connotation with the likes of anarchists and communists and democratic liberals. How would you differentiate your understanding of socialism from theirs?
Well, really, I think the whole left-right dichotomy is obsolete. We really didn't get this idea that socialism was associated with liberals. We think of left-right as beginning with the French Revolution, but really this association of socialism with liberalism only goes back to the Dreyfus affair in France. So during that time, you had anti-militarist socialists aligning themselves with sort of the cultural left, who was opposed to discrimination against Alfred Dreyfus and the right-wing attack on him. So you had an alignment of anti-military working class people and the cultural left. And it hasn't always worked out that way. And that's when you get Sorel, the great French syndicalist, writing Reflections on Violence. And in Sorel's Reflections on Violence, he reacts against this new parliamentary socialism, which would become what we'd call social democracy today, that the liberal middle classes, the liberal wealthy, have essentially absorbed the cause of the working class and have tied it to their own causes to essentially loot them, to become their self-proclaimed leaders, to gain parliamentary power, to gain their votes, to gain their trust, and deliver them crumbs once they've taken the cream of the crop. So it's never been a really strong marriage. And afterwards, you get this great alignment between socialists and nationalists coming out of what was called Cercle Proudhon in France. And I think that's really the great beginning of this socialist-nationalist collaboration, where you have the syndicalists, union men, working together with nationalists, because they see really parliamentary democracy as the rule of the large bankers, the large industrial cartels, who are both opposed to national identity and are oppressors of the working peoples.
All right. Maybe I should have rephrased the question. There's a kind of internationalist socialism, which we often identify with the Soviet Union. And there's a kind of more nationalistic or rooted socialism, which we might identify with Adolf Hitler or Mussolini. So maybe you could explain where you would lie along that plot.
Well, I think that it's sort of a false dichotomy, really, because what you see with eventually the Soviet Union develops this whole idea about socialist patriotism, and they resort to nationalist things, reviving the church, reviving the family after it had been abolished, restricting divorce, restricting abortion. So really, all socialism in any country needs to be applied to national conditions. Why, to simply just put this abstract internationalist socialism in place, it doesn't work. What began with the Russian Revolution, you see this abstract internationalist socialism, and really it didn't appeal to the Russian people, and it caused great conflicts within the Communist Party. And so eventually they had to revise their own version of socialism to create it for Russian conditions. And even all self-proclaimed communist movements throughout the world, they've pretty much all gone under the banner of national liberation fronts, Vietnam, Cuba. So really, international socialism is a theoretical pipe dream. There can only be a national it has to be nationalized. Even Gramsci talks about this in his writings on socialism. He says that the starting point for international cooperation begins with the nation. So therefore, these socialist intellectuals who imagine themselves internationalists, they need to rethink their way of conceiving socialism, because all international cooperation is based on, it's an emergent phenomenon from the nation. They need to rethink it to start with the nation and then work to create cooperation between nations internationally. So you can't have a socialism without referencing the nation. It's simply not going to stand.
Okay, so I guess what you're saying is that as far as international socialism and then a more nationalistic socialism, it's really kind of a continuum on how self-conscious the socialist leaders are. If they're self-conscious enough, they'll admit that, yeah, international socialism is a pipe dream. And only those leaders that might be lacking in self-awareness or self-consciousness keep this myth of international socialism going. Does that sound like a fair statement?
The only people who really believe in international socialists are mostly the clowns and far-left parties throughout the Western world that hand out pamphlets on the corner like it's 1940. Why even the Soviet bloc became very nationalistic. I mean, you look at Ceausescu's Romania with this phenomenon of Dacomania, where you were glorifying the ancient nations. So ultimately, all socialism in practice needs to be applied to a nation, because the point of ruling the nation, you need to understand the national consciousness.
Okay, so now for socialism, it's a word that has many different definitions and is often disagreed with. Now I know there's one common definition that many people in the West are familiar with: the state ownership of the means of production. Would that be a definition of socialism you would accept or reject?
I would reject that, because socialism doesn't necessarily imply the state. There's a large continuum. You can go from anarchist socialism all the way to totalitarian socialism. So I would call socialism really the people control the means of production. And what I mean by that is you're either a small businessman with a single family shop, or you're a cooperative, or you're a large industry that's run by a group of cooperatives. So it's a large continuum of things, but ultimately it means that the economy is cooperative and it's controlled not by a small group of capitalists, but by the people themselves. So you're either going to have, you can have personal, my idea of socialism was you can have personal property, a house, a family farm, a family business. But beyond that, once you go into larger forms of economic organization, they should be cooperative. And these different cooperatives should not compete with each other, but cooperate within themselves, between each other.
All right. I have a question. How does that line up with Mussolini's national corporations? As I understand it, Mussolini argued that each, as it were, trade within Italy, the miners, the lumberjacks, the fishermen, the coal miners, the iron ore miners, would all organize along a state union along trade lines. And then they would mediate between the worker and the state and help manage and plan production at that level. So one, is that a correct understanding of Mussolini's notion of corporatism? And two, if it is correct, is that a position that you are favorable to, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, Mussolini's corporatism, you had this idea that there would be a union, but there would also be a union for the large businessmen, and the state would mediate between those two. So ultimately, Mussolini's socialism, which originally was in many ways a very proletarian, pro-working class, very bottom-up socialism, became co-opted by the large businessmen, because to gain favor in the parliament, towards fascism, he essentially had to rely on the support of businessmen in negotiating these things between the workers. And so the state eventually ended up on the side of the big businessmen. That was the socialism of Mussolini from 1922 to 1943. After Mussolini's overthrown, he's rescued by the Nazis, and he begins this sort of rump state called the Italian Social Republic. And now that's a very different thing than the corporatism of Mussolini from 1922 to 1943, because it actually throws out the idea that the big corporations should be on equal negotiating field with the workers. And it directly puts things in the hands of labor syndicates themselves. It was actually advised by Nicola Bombaci, who had started out off as a communist, but became more in tune with Mussolini's militarism. And so the Italian Social Republic is perhaps a much better example of a true union-oriented socialism, where you have the unions calling the shots for themselves, not arguing with the state capitalists in the courts of fascism.
Okay. Now, you talked about socialism and worker control, if you will. How would you critique the certain left-wing anarchist or Western intellectualized socialism that is, of course, would deny race and nation and ethnicity and gender that we often see with like American anarchists? How would you maybe dissect that or investigate that?
Well, I see the collective as an emergent phenomenon, really. So the smallest collective you possibly have is the family. All collective identity, all socialization begins with the family. And then from the family, you go to towns and cities, and then between them, the nation, and then from the nation to international cooperation. So each of these different levels is a building block of a larger social project. You can't destroy one level of the project and expect it to work.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so I've heard you say before that the socialism as it's embodied in a nation is different for each nation. So some people on the alternative right tend to idolize a certain period of National Socialism in Germany or fascism in Italy. But I think you would say that, well, that might have been necessary at the time and the place for those people, but it wouldn't be acceptable for people in other countries or even for those same people today. So maybe why don't you get a little bit about how each nation has its own particular expression of socialism in time and place?
Yes, and each nation has its own different characteristics, whether they are more favorable to more centralization, whether they are favorable to more decentralization, regionalism, localism, state planning. All of these are different variables within socialism that can be adjusted depending on the characteristics of the people. And then within each nation, there are different variants of socialism. When Nazism was rising to the time, there was a wide variety of nationalist socialist movements. Many of them were actually competitors to Nazism. And even within the Nazi party, there were competing nationalist and socialist strains, which were purged. Strasserism, in the Night of the Long Knives, Ernst Röhm, they were a different variant of nationalism and socialism, but they were all German. They all focused on the idea of the German nation, what socialism would mean for the Germanic people. Whereas, say, in France, you have a Cercle Proudhon, you have the neo-socialists, which eventually became influential a bit in the Vichy regime. You have certain left-wing Gaullists who are very favorable to a sort of a dirigiste economy where you have free enterprise, but it's guided by the state. So every nation has its own variant of socialism, and within that nation, there are different shadings of that socialism.
All right. Within the American context, how would you imagine a kind of nationalistic socialism arising?
First of all, I'd say that the great figure for that would be, as American as apple pie, Jack London. He was very much involved with the labor movement, but again, he appealed to the nationalism of the American people, very much opposed to mass immigration, very much in favor of keeping America as a white nation. Now, I don't think that perhaps today that might be so acceptable, but I think America has a long labor tradition, and the working class has traditionally been very sort of socially conservative. They're in favor of nationalism, they are in favor of Christianity, they're against multiculturalism, the LGBT agenda, etc. So the material is there. It's very interesting to note that the same people who were involved in, say, the radical coal miners and the IWW are the same people who are now supporting, say, militia movements and opposing the centralization of the federal government. So I think the ultimate lesson for all these American working class movements, whether of the left or the right, is that they're against sort of this big centralized planning, whether it be corporate or state. So it's obviously going to be a localized form of socialism. It's going to be based on labor unions, the American historical labor struggle. It's going to be based on regional working identities, the religious identities of the working class. I think places like, say, Appalachia, where you had the great coal wars in the 1930s and stuff, would be a good start. They think these people are very patriotic, very much religious, but also very skeptical of control by large entities, whether they be corporate or government. So it will be a libertarian, delocalized socialism that emphasizes sort of the defense of the local community, their heritage, and their beliefs.
Okay. Now, with socialism, not in America, with the anarchist or socialist tradition, however you want to look at it, we had the likes of Josiah Warren, Benjamin Tucker, and such. How would you classify those individuals?
Well, they're very much, Tucker's individualist, but there's also a mutualist strain to it as well. So I think they're sort of a very fringe of, they're definitely American. America has a certain individualist tenor to it, but they still keep a certain mutualist idea as well. So you can have this celebration of being the individual within the idea of cooperative economics as well. So I don't think those are necessarily separated from the Jack London labor tradition of socialism.
Okay, why don't you explain what you mean by cooperative ownership of businesses?
So a business will start, and it will be one man, his family perhaps, a bakery. They start to expand. Once they hire more workers, these workers should have a say in the business. Perhaps it should be based, now perhaps they shouldn't have an exact equal say, but it should be based on, say, seniority, that more experienced workers would have a higher say. It becomes a cooperative. So a family business expands, it becomes cooperative. Larger corporations become cooperative, and these cooperatives, they cooperate with each other, they do not compete with each other. So the whole economy becomes based around this idea of cooperatives.
Okay, and you mentioned that the authority might be weighted. So, you know, a total greenhorn that got hired yesterday might not have the same say as a 15-year, you know, veteran of the firm. Now, you made a distinction between private property and, I think, personal property. Would you want to explain that?
Yes, personal property would be, say, one's house. Things that aren't used to produce things. You don't use your house as a means of production. So the means of production should be cooperative, but you can still have your own house, your own car, your own television, personal luxuries, etc.
Okay. Now let's look at a farmer or something like that. Let's say his personal property is, you know, the house, the tools in which he keeps, the shed in which he keeps his farming implements, and then you know, maybe the immediate acreage around it. But if he uses that to grow food or to cultivate livestock, and that doesn't that then become a means of production? Where does that line get drawn?
It does become a means of production, but so long as it's him and his family, that's still cooperative. Once you bring on farmhands, and if they don't have a say in the business, then that becomes non-cooperative.
Okay, so it's less a function of size than a function of employees that are hired. Now, granted, the larger the firm, the more employees would need to be hired. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is that as long as it's you and your immediate family, whatever business enterprise you're engaged in is your own affair. But the minute you hire people beyond your immediate family, then it becomes a kind of community concern. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true. I would say that's accurate.
Okay. What are some of the reasons that you might provide for justifying such a position?
The reasons I'd provide for justifying a position is because I believe that everyone should be able to participate in the construction of the nation. Why socialism and nationalism are two sides of the coin, that everyone should have a say, not an equal say, but a say in the construction of the nation and in the construction of the national economy, that everyone should be involved as a piece, that they cannot simply be a tool. They need to be integrated into it. They need to have a say, no matter how small or big. It can be unequal, but they should be involved. They need to be a part of a greater national family.
Okay. Now, I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. From a libertarian perspective, a libertarian would say, well, if I own the land and I hire people to work for me, I don't really see why I would need to have a kind of cooperative arrangement where we're constantly negotiating with my employees, because I paid them and they freely chose to accept my agreement because we both profited from the arrangement. Now, what would you see as maybe problematic with that stock libertarian?
Well, I think the great conflict is not between capitalism and socialism or individualism and collectivism. It's rather what the German economist Werner Sombart talked about, the heroic mindset versus the mercantile mindset. The heroic mindset says, how can I serve someone else? The mercantile mindset says, what can I get for myself? And so this idea that I'm going to maximize my own profit and to hell with everyone else, that's not socially optimal. It's eventually leads to the point where, oh, we could just dispense with these workers and replace them with robots. We can dispense with the people in our own country and replace them with people in the third world. And that leads to some very serious social consequences, perhaps even violent ones.
Okay. Wasn't it Sombart? You're speaking of Werner Sombart, correct?
Yes, yes.
Wasn't it the case that Engels said Werner Sombart was the only individual to actually understand Das Kapital?
Yes, that's true.
That's what I thought. So within this sort of nationalistic socialist arrangement that's contingent upon each nation's needs, where does a sort of free market or sort of laissez-faire system fit in to this system?
Well, you can have a sort of free association of cooperatives. They wouldn't be focused on the profit motive or it's contractual, but it wouldn't need to be centrally planned. You could have a free association of cooperatives, each determining who they would cooperate with freely.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Canadian Hutterites?
Yes, they're like Mennonites.
Yeah,
I think the Amish model is a form of socialism.
that's what I was going to ask you. If you look at the Hutterite, Amish, Mennonite economic system, how would you analyze it within this framework?
I would say it's a primitive socialist nationalism. They have their own distinct traditions. They have the Mennonite nation. It's a closed off community, and they live by cooperative means. Yes, that is a form of nationalist socialism.
Interesting. Yeah, I sort of am sympathetic and to some extent identify with those groups, and I was interested to hear what your perspective was on it. One of the things that I know about the Amish is that they, as individuals, when they create firms, they don't compete against one another. They work together. So, for instance, I think, like, according to the Pareto principle, 20% of all business, or 80% of all business startups fail and only 20% succeed. But in the Amish community, the Pareto principle is reversed. 80% succeed. And that's due to, of course, their cooperative nature, which maybe is an argument for why such a system of economics is superior to cutthroat competition. But what does, in your economics, in the economic system you've articulated, how would you view usury?
Well, I'm totally against it. I think it's a form of exploitation. I think that it should be banned. I mean, money is a problematic concept in itself. If you read like the works of Muammar Gaddafi, he said his idea of his socialism would evolve to eliminate the idea of money. But I think ultimately we need to move away from the idea of loans, banking. Maybe we need to move towards credit unions that are not based on usury or minimal usury. Social credit is an idea that should be explored. And the idea of state credit, where the state just prints money and uses it to buy goods and services. I don't think that we need to loan. When we print money, we loan it to banks, and then they loan it to the greater population, and then the government takes out loans from these same banks. So we're accumulating all of this interest, this money from nothing. That's just a drain on the economy.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that the Islamic banking system was one of the few banking systems that weathered the 2007 financial crisis fairly well. And that was in part because the Islamic banking system didn't practice in a lot of these money speculation based around usury. In Islamic law, I call it riba. And for them, it's prohibited by Allah. But it's interesting, though, that they weathered the storm much better than those Western firms that were over-leveraged and were deeply indebted to usury. And it's interesting also that, at least in the Abrahamic faiths, both Judaism, Islam, and Christianity have a lot of negative to say about usury. Very, very negative. And it's really only in the Renaissance, I think, that usury became widely accepted in the West. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, that's quite true. Traditionally, even in the pagans, usury was considered bad. Aristotle viewed it as unnatural and abomination. The Romans considered it an aberrant way to make money. And this was adopted by the church fathers in Christianity, continued in Islam. And so this continues pretty much up to the domination of the Catholic Church. And it was people like John Calvin who gave usury the go-ahead. And then also with Catholic bankers and Sephardic bankers, the kingdoms of Spain began borrowing huge money from these bankers in Genoa and Venice, the Dutch Jewish community, and then the English. And so around the time of the Renaissance, you get this huge explosion of banking that continues into the mercantile age. And it's a consequence of the defeat of Catholicism, and also a new mindset, right? The sort of Protestant work ethic that if you're rich, you deserve it. And the people who fail are somehow being punished by God or undesired. And so it was a cultural shift that presaged the rise of usury.
Now, in the Catholic world, you had the rise of the Medicis and the Thuggers, which I think facilitated that. But didn't also Werner Sombart argue that the Protestant view of usury was actually a Jewish view of usury, and that Protestantism, in some sense, was mainstreaming certain Jewish concepts?
Yes, he did. We did not mean that in an anti-Semitic way, though. In fact, it's very funny that today Sombart's considered by some anti-Semitic because he associates Judaism with the mercantile mindset. But when his works were published, he was actually considered philo-Semitic for identifying Judaism with the mercantile mindset. So it is true, and I think Protestantism tried to strip away a lot of the pagan influence on Catholicism and go back to the Hebraic traditions.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. Now, one of the common defenses of usury that you might hear from someone of a libertarian background is that risk. If somebody asks for an investment, which is varying degrees of risk, you have no guarantee that money is going to come back to you. Maybe the investment and the venture is successful, maybe it's not. And the libertarian would argue, well, it's risky and they need to be compensated for their risk, and usury is a form of compensation for the inherent riskiness of loans. What critique might you have against that kind of defensive usury?
Well, if we say that the interest rate means that the loan is riskier, so you're going to charge a higher interest rate for a riskier investment, that means that you're going to be demanding more from that investment when the loan payments start coming. So there's a higher chance that that investment will fail because you're sucking more wealth off it. So if we say higher risk, higher interest, there's a greater chance that that enterprise is going to fail. And so I see this as really an attempt by the holders of capital to destroy smaller businesses by charging the riskier clients higher interest. That means they fail more often and their properties are seized by the banks. And so it becomes a great way for banks to just assimilate all this property. It's a great theft.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This question of risk and usury, I think, is poignantly expressed in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, where the protagonist leverages his trade fleets against the Jew Shylock. And of course, he hopes that they come back in time with enough revenue to help him pay off the Jew. But of course, in The Merchant of Venice, that's not the case. The debts come calling and the ships are sunk. And so, through a very interesting and involved court trial, he's eventually restored to his property, and Shylock the Jew is punished for his lasciviousness. And it turns out that some of his ships actually did come back home. And I think what's interesting with The Merchant of Venice and Shakespeare and usury is he's expressing a Abrahamic concept that, yes, it's inherently risky, but within the Abrahamic tradition, God will cover the risk. You don't need to charge usury or interest, but have faith that God will bring your goods back. Or if they don't come back, he will find a way to help you get through. And I think it's an interesting account of how Shakespeare looks at the interplay between risk and usury and all of that stuff.
Yes, I agree. I think that ultimately the Christian idea is that God will have mercy on the poor people, that God will take care of the poor. And originally, I believe in the Jewish faith, it was illegal to loan money to other Jews. It had to be someone on the outside, a non-believer, a Gentile. So
yeah,
I
that's
think
correct.
within the greater Christian community, it should be accepted that God will take care of the poor and that we shouldn't be treating these people as means of production. We shouldn't be treating them as something to leverage debt with.
Yeah, exactly. So you had mentioned earlier about having proportional say, workers having proportional say in a firm. How would that proportion be allotted along gender lines?
Well, I think it's up to the gender roles in the society, really. If it's an Islamic country, then they should follow Islamic gender roles. If it's a Christian country, depending on the sect, whatever, Protestant, Calvinist, Catholic, Orthodox, they should all follow their own separate gender roles. So gender's a thing that varies from culture to culture. So obviously it's going to be culturally dependent. As I said, every nation has its own form of socialism, and that socialism is going to reflect the moral norms of the nation. So how a woman gets her voice heard or not, that's dependent on each national tradition.
Okay. As just more of a personal question, you've already admitted that the socialist systems for each nation is contingent upon the historical conditions of that nation. But from your perspective, which alternative to you is the most aesthetically desirable?
What is the most aesthetically desirable?
Or like if you had to live in which of these socialist examples would you prefer to live in? Let me put it that way.
Interesting question.
Like, would you prefer like an American kind of socialism, or maybe a Russian kind of socialism, or maybe a German kind of socialism? Like, if you had to live in that society, which one would you be most comfortable with?
Well, most realistically, I suppose I've only ever lived in America. Though I'm very interested in all the other forms. I've studied the Germans quite well. So probably somewhere between those two, though I don't think we can necessarily identify German socialism with Nazism, though aesthetically, yes, there was great aesthetic accomplishments of Nazism.
Speaking of German socialism, I'm reminded of, let's see, it was Prussian Socialism, which was an interesting essay by
Oswald Spengler.
Oswald Spengler, thank you, yes. And he described Prussian socialism as a great example he gave. It's like a game of chess. There are strict rules for how you play the game, but you're free to make the move of the piece. And I find that to be a very interesting analogy of how you can have a kind of structured society that respects human freedom.
Yes, I think for the Prussian, it was, you can have private property, his idea was, but the idea is that your private property, you're really a trustee of it for society. You're not using the private property to enrich yourself. You're a caretaker for the greater nation.
Yeah. In many ways, I think that's somewhat analogous to the Christian concept of stewardship, rather than, instead of being we hold property as a stewardship for God. In the Spengler sense, it would be we hold it as a stewardship for the nation. But now Oswald Spengler, he wrote in Prussian Socialism as well that I remember he said that he said he wishes the German conservatives in the late World War I era had allied with the socialists, the Spartacists, and the rest of them, rather than fight them, because I think he believed that if the German conservatives had allied with the Spartacists, there might have been a kind of fusionist movement that could have rallied the German nation against the defeat by the Allies.
Yes, that's quite true. There was an early experiment called Hamburg National Communism, led by Wolfheim and Laufenberg, and it was part of the larger communist uprising, but it aligned itself with nationalism. They were against Versailles. They wanted to end the dictate of Versailles over Germany. And unfortunately, this appeal to nationalism appalled the rest of the communists, who immediately excommunicated them from the party. It actually got a very nasty little note by Lenin in left communism and infantile disorder. And so this Hamburg national communism would have presaged a larger nationalist and socialist alliance rallying the workers in a proletarian uprising against both the capitalists and the power of Versailles. And so it was seen that the powers of Versailles were working with the German capitalists. The German capitalists had agreed to pay off the reparations to Versailles. They'd agreed to accept the economic influence of the West, and they were willing to work with this international economy.
Yeah. So now I've heard you talk before about National Bolshevism. Why don't you explain what that is?
Yeah, that's coming out of this German school. And so that was perhaps the most radical form of one of the competitors of National Socialism, where it essentially saw that the German people were held under the control of the Versailles powers by capitalism, that the capitalist system had reduced the German people to being a colonialized people by the French, by the English, by the Americans. And so the idea was to overthrow capitalism as a means of national liberation. And so it did believe in the class struggle, but believed in it as a flip side of nationalism, that the people, the working class, were nationalistic, and the wealthy were compradors with the Versailles regime. And so it advocated a nationalist revolution. Ernst Niekisch was the major progenitor of this. He wrote a tract against Hitler. He was a competing force with Hitler. Also Ernst Jünger, the great World War I hero, he had this idea of the worker. He sort of redefined the worker as a revolutionary figure outside of communism, whereas communism was based in purely mechanical economic forms. Jünger sees the worker as this Promethean figure that bears the spirit of the age. And so it takes these ideas from the left, class struggle, socialism, revolution, and it bases them not so much on economics, but as a means of national liberation.
All right. You know, that quote reminds me, what you said reminds me of a statement by Henning von Treschow, one of the German officers who was executed after the failed July 20th bomb plot on Hitler. He wrote at his son's confirmation in 1943, which again I think lines up with Spengler's Prussian socialism. The idea of freedom can never be disassociated from real Prussia. The real Prussian spirit means a synthesis between restraint and freedom, between voluntary subordination and conscientious leadership, between pride in oneself and consideration for others, between rigor and compassion. Unless a balance is kept between these qualities, the Prussian spirit is in danger of degenerating into soulless routine or narrow-minded dogmatism. And I think it's a very interesting account, sort of a side quote that's referencing maybe the chess game where you have rules, but you have free to make the moves, the pieces on the board. But on another note, Mussolini and Italian fascism came up with a unique notion of the proletariat nation. Maybe why don't you explain that a little bit?
Yes, so nations themselves can be a working nation. They are focused on, they embody the spirit of the worker, whereas you have these rich capitalist nations that are exploiting them. So you, instead of class conflict within the nation between the capitalists of the nation and the proletariat of the nation, you have class conflict between nations, where you have a wealthy nation that's seeking rent, a rentier nation, from the proletarian nation. So you have nations that own these huge global financial systems that are exploiting the proletarian nations, these different colonial nations, or in Italy's case, Italy's playing second fiddle to the Versailles powers, that it's viewed as a lesser nation by the other victors of World War I, and they want to have their way over Italy by exploiting it.
Yeah. Now, I guess what would you look for to identify a proletarian nation? What kind of cues or signals would you have to look for to identify a proletarian nation?
Well, I would identify the proletarian nation by how its financial system is integrated with the nations of within the economics of other nations. If their financial system is dependent on other nations for loans, and the other nations are taking off rent payments for them, you see this a lot in the third world, where you have these big Western powers giving loans to these third world nations that they can never repay off, and that they're increasingly generating this debt that keeps them even more enthralled to the first world powers. So if there's a flow from the one nation to another, where one nation is giving loans and taking usurious interest from the other nation, the nation that's paying for these loans is the proletarian nation. And the nation that's giving these loans is the rentier nation, is the capitalist nation.
Was the United States of America ever a proletarian nation?
I think parts of the United States of America are. I think that it's a regional phenomenon in the United States, where you see industrial regions or post-industrial regions are having their wealth being drained off by these financial capitals to New York, to Wall Street, to London. You're seeing in the United States a sort of phenomenon called peripheral capitalism, where you have this vast periphery that is being continually having their wealth taken off. So the money flows from, say, the industrial regions, or what used to be the industrial regions, to the financial center now. So these industrial regions are essentially the proletarian nation to the financial center.
Yeah, in many ways, I think the American South would be an example of that proletarian portion of the nation. What do you think are the best tools available to combat international capital?
That's a very hard question, especially in the West. I think in sort of the third world, you have this memory of a time before capitalism. You have this idea that capitalism is very alien to the third world. And so that in the third world, that sets things up for nationalist liberation movements, all these revolutionary groups. But in the West, it's going to be much more complex. So I think that what we're seeing now in the West, where we're seeing vast swaths of a country, whether it be England, where you've had the Thatcherite neoliberalism destroying the industrial core of England, same thing in France, same thing in the United States. You have these regions of the nation that have essentially been turned into post-industrial hinterlands surrounding a small financial center that is controlling. So the attack against capitalism is obviously going to come from the post-industrial regions. And it's going to be people just no longer going to pay these debt payments. They're going to refuse to hand over things to debt collectors, repossession men. They're going to refuse to participate in the larger system, and they're going to move towards their own forms of economics. They're going to form their own cooperative businesses. They're going to form their own credit unions. I think credit unions would be a very good start. I think cooperative farming would be a very good start. Small businesses working together would be a very good start. And also, I think the idea of a regional identity would be a good start as well, that the regions are asserting themselves as the poor, impoverished regions against the financial power of the hinterland. They assert their own culture, they assert their own traditions, they unplug from this sort of bland, TV-controlled, Hollywood-controlled media, and they form their own regional cultures that reinforces their own social identity. So they no longer have to rely on the media controlled by the financial centers. It's essentially going to be the people putting the economy and the culture in their own hands.
All right. I think it's time to close. Thanks for coming on, Eugene. Why don't you let people know where they can get a hold of you?
Yes, you can contact me by email at emontsalvat@gmail.com, or you can read my various translations on Write On, my articles on Write On. You can read the Nikish Translation Project, which is the German National Bolshevik. You can read The Disintegration of the System, which is an Italian third position work I've translated. So you can contact me on those various blogs by email or via Write On. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Eugene. This is Todd Lewis from the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.